Hello, fifth grade civics students. Welcome to our second lesson of Monday, October 5th. We are embarking on our second week of social studies and civics. Our materials that you will need for today are listed right up here. You are going to need a notebook where you've been writing down your other notes. And the focus question for today, and be sure to take your time writing this down. If you need to pause the video, go for it. Say it with me together. Our focus question is, what is the significance of voting in America? Ooh, one more time. What is the significance of voting in America? And a second focus question I wanted to introduce today is, how has voting changed throughout history? How has voting changed throughout history? Now, we aren't going to go into the specifics of how voting has changed throughout history yet. However, many of us know that there are some really incredible voting facts that are still talked about today. Even Miss Quinn in our Friday Glenview gathering spoke about our Voting Rights Act of 1965 in our Glenview gathering. And so really some of us might be able to make a connection of, I did some additional research after that because I wanted to know what that was, what Miss Quinn was talking about. And, you know, also considering other times in which you have just had an organic conversation with your family about this. We know that this is on all of our minds, especially as we are nearing T-minus 1 month until our general election. So really our general question, and ignore all the math behind me, this is from our math problem earlier, but really our big question is going to be around the voting system. What is the voting system in the United States of America? If you have any other questions that are coming up for you, go ahead and write them in the live chat. If you're like, who gets to vote? How old do you have to be to vote? Do you only have to vote for one candidate? Do people vote for candidates, or do they vote for values and policies? These are some questions that I have. And some of you might already have answers to those. Some of you might be wondering the same thing. But either way, we're going to go and do some good note taking today. And with that, let's get into it. So here is our beloved United States of America. We have a lot going on in our country. And when I think of what's happening in our country, well, we have these two core pieces. We have voting and democracy. Well, part of when we consider what voting is, we kind of have to take a step back and ask ourselves, what is democracy and how does voting have to do with democracy? Well, as you see below, we've defined democracy as, and read it out loud with me, you should be able to see this, a system of government. Talked about what a system is. We know what our government systems are, by the whole population or all the eligible members of a state, eligible members meaning citizens, typically through elected representatives. Now, another way that we can define democracy is like a democratic process. And one of those, you know, when we think of democracy, we think of, okay, we're going to have a vote in our classroom. Okay, everyone heads down, right? Remember, I would ask all of us to, you know, give each other privacy. And this is like really modeled after what the voting process is like. Our voting needs to have integrity. And part of having integrity is doing what you think is the right thing, no matter what other people are doing, right? We don't want to bog ourselves down with whoever else, what your friend is going to vote for. You need to vote for what you believe in. And this is key with democracy. Democracy typically refers to the majority vote. If a majority of us in the classroom vote for, and you know, today during closing, we're going to have a Democratic vote for what kind of Friday theme we're going to have. And so how that's going to work is majority means more than half. And this is why it's for the people. When you have a majority viewpoint, that means that majority, that's the way most of our citizens are feeling about a particular issue or about a particular candidate. And the way that we really uphold this, this piece of democracy is by voting and by expressing your viewpoints. And we express our viewpoints by voting. So our definition for voting, and go ahead and say it out loud with me: a way for citizens to participate in democracy by casting their vote in an election. So we have a big election coming up. We do. And a way for citizens to participate, there's lots of different ways in which we can vote. And I'm looking, I see Ava has asked, why do you not have to vote? Oh my gosh, what a phenomenal question, right? I've been watching a lot of really informative documentaries and news recently, talking about the historical importance of our vote. Now, some of us might know that just 100 years ago, women were allowed to vote, thanks to the 19th Amendment. Now, if we're looking at numbers of who votes in our society, it is shocking and quite upsetting to find out that we do not have some of the highest voting turnout in the entire world. That also, other countries that are democratic in nature. And so it is a stark reality when we find out that people don't vote. Well, currently don't have laws in place that say you have to vote. Actually, this is going to be something quite interesting as we do more research further on. We'll find out why there are a lot of people who whose votes, who weren't able to go and vote, or who tried to vote and weren't able to because of lines and maybe a misrepresented signature on their vote. But before we get into all of that, let's move forward and see, well, how do people vote, right? This is a great question for us moving forward. And really, Ava, I love that you asked this question. This is a question that we all have to ask ourselves, right? When we notice that people aren't voting, why aren't they voting? Is it wrong to ask family members, why are you choosing not to vote? I think that that's an absolutely great question to ask family members if they've said that they do not partake in our democratic process by voting. Well, let's ask ourselves this question, right? How do citizens vote? There are two ways that citizens vote. The first is with a ballot, and the second is with something called an absentee ballot. Give me I've heard of both of these. Yes, I've heard of these. I want to know more. Well, we define a ballot as this. In order to vote in an election, voters must complete a ballot. Now, I put a little picture of a sample ballot, and this would be if we were voting for a new House of Representative for California. And really, when you're voting, many of you, I would love, love, love for you to ask your parents, how are you voting this year? Are you going to go in person and do so safely with social distancing, or are your parents planning on doing an absentee ballot? Now, California is super fascinating, right? We have a lot going on right now in the age of COVID to, number one, protect people who wouldn't normally be able to go into the polls, and for people who may or may not feel comfortable going into the polls. So we have ballots and absentee ballots. Now, a ballot is a big document with all the choices for each of the candidates of different categories. So this year we know that we have our presidential candidacy. We know that we are going to have to vote for a vice president with that. We are going to be voting on a lot of local measures as well. There's Prop 15, for example. There is Prop 22. There are a handful of different propositions that are telling us different things that we want for our community to make change. And so in order for your vote to count, you must complete a ballot. Now, our election this year is a general election. There's also primaries and midterms. And those are a little bit more, those are different types of elections. But really right now we're focusing on the general election. And the general election, as many of you know, happens once every 4 years. Okay? A general election happens once every 4 years. The absentee ballot, I personally am really grateful that we have a democracy that allows an absentee ballot because it is designed for citizens who cannot get to the polls, whether they are college students living away from home, whether they are military personnel who might be posted somewhere else temporarily, and maybe a person who is disabled. Today, especially with COVID, quarantine, and social distancing going on, our state in particular is one of a handful of states that are saying we need all of our citizens in our state to have absentee ballots. This is a core piece of, we're going to get into it in a moment, of our parties, our political parties, and what their values are, right? Now, we have a Democratic governor who believes that everybody should have a right to vote. So this is a very interesting relationship where we're noticing that some states, not all, are saying everyone deserves an absentee ballot because nobody should have to put themselves in a position where they need to put themselves at risk by going in somewhere and voting when they don't have to. When they can vote from the calmness of their own home, right? There's nothing like sitting back and getting to do it's almost like citizen work, right? I don't know if I want to call it homework or schoolwork. It's like citizen work. I know Mr. Taco loves to vote by absentee ballots. My husband and I, we love going in and voting in person. It's up to the individual what they want to do. And really, this is where other things come into play because we know that states have the right to choose certain things. So not all states are sending absentee ballots out. It is only if they request it. So take a look at that bottom part. Voters must request an absentee ballot. Great. Any questions about ballots or absentee ballots? Go ahead and throw that in our live chat. The last thing we're going to talk about today in our lesson is, well, we've understood that our system of government has lots of parts and subsystems within it. We have our, we have our 3 branches of government that work together. We know that there's a lot of power that comes into play with our big systems of government, whether it's executive, legislative, or judicial. But they're not the only people who get power. We, as voters, as citizens, get power through democracy. This is what makes America great. And I say that not in a mocking way. It really is something that when you go to other countries that are not democratic in nature, this is a country that prides itself on virtues and ideals of democracy, which means that people have a voice, and people have a right to be heard. So we've talked about how voting really fits into this core idea of democracy. And we know that United States of America was founded on this premise of democracy. We've talked about, well, how do citizens vote? Now we need to ask ourselves, well, who do we vote for, right? Even within these branches of government, there are two big parties. Say them with me, the Democrats and the Republicans. So this is big. This is huge. This is kind of challenging in a way because it's really hard to say that with every kind of person, they can only fit into two categories. Even in these two categories, of course, there are people who are different. Before we go into that route, let's take a look at what makes Democrats Democrats and what makes Republicans Republicans. Democrats are known as being the left wing or leftist. This means that they are more liberal in their beliefs. Liberal meaning that they actively pursue equity and equality, right? They're constantly trying to find what is good for everyone. Oftentimes, their votes tend to go more in the sense of healthcare for people, right? The concept of universal healthcare. Consider President Obama introduced the Affordable Healthcare Act. Now, the Affordable Healthcare Act was also known as Obamacare. It's the same thing. And this is, at its core, a belief that says everybody has the right to free healthcare. And because everyone has the right to that, it is our government's job to provide that. So I'm going to say that. I want you to think about that for a moment, right? Consider, there are a lot of things going on right now, depending on your job. If you don't have a job, if you have Medi-Cal, Medicaid, all these other health programs that are there to support people who need health care, but it is not designed for everybody. This is the biggest part of Democrats, of the Democratic Party, is that they see the role of government as taking care of and providing services like healthcare, right? Like transportation, like making sure our roads are, clean and safe to drive on. They want to make sure that the government is providing services and taking care of its citizens. The Republicans are known as the right wing. Okay. There's another nickname for the Republicans. Oftentimes you might have heard them called the GOP. GOP stands for Grand Ole Party. Grand Ole Party. This has a lot of historical roots. We will pick this up on another time, but that's something else that you might hear on the news. People saying, well, the GOP said this. And you're like, what is the GOP? Now you know. What's the GOP? It's another word for Republican, or GOP stands for Grand Ole Party. Now, Republicans tend to be more conservative in their beliefs. And what I mean by conservative is they really don't think that the government should be involved in making choices for its citizens. They don't want the government involved in their lives. They often think that the government's role is just for essential services, and that they really put the individual's choice on above the collective of a whole community. And really, this is a big piece, right, of thinking, well, I don't want the government making choices for me, but I want the government to provide a foundation to, make sure that everyone is taken care of. But really, when we look historically at these two parties, of course, these parties have changed over the course of history. Many of us know that our beloved Abraham Lincoln was a Republican, and this is back when the Republican Party actually stood for some different beliefs, which is kind of surprising, right? But like all things change over time. Similarly, if we look at history of, who have been Democrats and who have been Republicans, Democrats are more often made up of minority groups, groups of people of color, Black, African American people, Jewish people, Latinx people, Asian and Pacific Islander groups of people tend to vote more Democratic. There are absolutely minorities who vote Republican, absolutely, right? Just because of how you look doesn't mean you're going to vote a certain way. However, in history, Republicans often have been either in more rural areas, so areas that are not in a city, have been more religious, have been more conservative in the fact that they're not going to vote for those social pieces of universal health care, let's say, or universal K through 12 and upper college, right? And when you look at Democrats really have a lot of democratic socialism beliefs of feeling like the government's role is to take care of people and offer social services that are going to make sure that people are taken care of. So really, we went through a lot in these almost 23 minutes that we've been talking. I want to leave off with this. When we are thinking of who we vote for, in our history, we've been told you either vote for Democrat or Republican. Now, I want us to consider that the Democratic and Republican parties are absolutely an outline for how we understand and see politics. However, that doesn't mean that we're voting for that person. We're voting for values. We're voting for policy because our government is a democracy, right? And we have to think, well, we're voting for people who uphold these values, who uphold the change or the lack of change that we want to see in our community. So, knowing this, your takeaway for today is, number one, ask your parents, ask your family, how are you voting? Will you be voting by ballot, in person, or absentee this year? Ask them if you can look at the ballot, if they have an absentee ballot at home with you. And ask questions. Why are we voting for this person over this person? Now, this is one of those moments where, remember back in 4th grade, and even in this year, I always would ask us, you've made a claim, now we got to support it with evidence, right? So when we make a claim about who is going to be the best candidate for something, we've got to support it with evidence. So on that note, I hope you have a wonderful afternoon. I will see you